Berikut daftar game terbaru update Maret 2022 untuk PlayStation 4 dan 5 juga untuk Xbox.
March is creeping up fast, and you know what that means? A slew of new games we are excited to play. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Game Ranks, games that deserve your attention in March of 2022. Starting off at number 10, it's Elix II. You might remember that Elix I came out back in 2017. I did the before you buy for it, and I wasn't really too positive about it. I didn't say it was a bad game, but I also called it tedious and that it didn't really feel a whole lot different than anything out of the mid-2000s, just with better graphics. The idea is that an element was introduced to this world by a comet crashing. That element is called Elix. It grants users of it special powers. Some people got addicted to it, just like the splicers from BioShock, and the game is kind of jumbled and can't decide exactly what it wants to be. It has positive aspects, has a very large, pretty world to explore. At times it has a worthwhile story, but it didn't have a whole lot to say in terms of like what matters in this world. It didn't feel particularly inspired or grounded in some real sentiment. But I mean, if you're a fan of Piranha Bytes, it is a Piranha Bytes game. And from everything I've seen of Elix II, it's a continuation of the story, continuation of the world. Apparently the jetpack has received some kind of improvement, and the game otherwise feels a lot more smooth. But I also haven't seen anybody say like it's markedly different from the first. So while some of the complaints I had about the first game were that it was a little janky and traversal could be kind of tedious, and it seems like they fixed those things, it's up to the writers, because it doesn't seem like Piranha Bytes is really interested in revamping the open world RPG formula. So will they give us a story that makes it worthwhile? Will they not just deluge us with exposition throughout the entire game? Will they intrigue us? Will they compel us? That's really the question. And given so much of my complaints about the first game were mechanical, and my primary problem with the story was just an overabundance of information, and the ultimate Metacritic score for the game was a 67, not only are the problems not the hardest thing to fix, but they also have incentive to fix them, because I don't think I was wrong in terms of the overall opinion that formed over the following years. Could this be a significantly better game without a complete and total overhaul? Absolutely. And whether it does or doesn't do that, I am morbidly curious in this game, because honestly, there was a lot of promise the first time around that I felt like if they just had some input, they would have more completely realized. Elix 2 lands on PC, the Xboxes, and the PlayStations March 1st. At number 9 is Weird West, a game that comes to us from Wolfeye Studios, which is comprised of some of the folks who co-created both Dishonored and the recent Arcane version of Prey. It's essentially a dark fantasy reimagining of a Wild West setting in which you'll be gathering other adventurers, forming a posse, and otherwise surviving in a world where both gunslinging and mythical beasts are the norm. Now, this game both touts a sandbox as well as a very deep, detailed world, and frankly, I'm pretty interested in it personally. Obviously, if you've listened to Game Ranks for any period of time, you know how much I am a big fan of Arcane's Dishonored, and while not to as much of an extent as Dishonored, Prey as well. And this is a pretty different thing from those types of folks. I think it has a lot of potential, and I will certainly be giving it a shot when it lands on PC, PS4, and Xbox One on March 31st. And number 8 is Babylon's Fall, a game that you would probably just totally accidentally miss as a Platinum Games game, but I would implore you not to. Just as I'm a huge fan of Dishonored and Arcane Studios, Platinum Games is among my favorite developers, and a new action RPG hack and slash from them is always going to get my attention, especially a 4-player co-op one. Now obviously, this one has a very different aesthetic. It exists in kind of a Dark Souls meets Rome world, but rest assured, it's not Dark Souls. everything I've seen of Babylon's Fall makes it look like a game that maybe takes some of its world building and traversal cues from Dark Souls, but retains all the absolutely absurd combat of a Platinum Games game. And I think that people have incorrectly identified it as safe because, yes, it does have a bit of a look like it's in the area of Dark Souls, but I think, given what we know about Platinum doing open world from games like Nier Automata, I think we're actually in for a pretty different experience, and I am crossing my fingers that it might inspire more arcade style Dark Souls type games, like a Platinum Souls-like, so to speak. Anyway, that comes to PC, PS4, and PS5 on March 3rd. And number 7 is Kirby and the Forgotten Land, the 17th mainline installment of the Kirby series. However, the very first 3D mainline entry. I think this is a kind of an interesting idea for Kirby, on account it's a mainline Kirby game that just totally switches up the environment. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic landscape called the Forgotten Land. Don't make the mistake of thinking that it isn't a colorful game. Like, it's perhaps the cutest version of a post-apocalypse I've ever seen, and I actually look forward to exploring it specifically for that reason. The world itself conjures The Last of Us to me if The Last of Us was a children's cartoon and there was no fungus. Honestly, the way that this game looks put together really intrigues me, and I've always enjoyed Kirby games, so I'm fairly excited to give this one a go. Kirby and the Forgotten Land comes to Switch March 25th. And number 6 is Shadow Warrior 3, the sequel to the 2016 game, which was a sequel to the 2013 game. Obviously, there's a larger span of time between 2 and 3 than 1 and 2, and even 1 itself was a reboot of a 1997 game. I think that it's really interesting what Flying Wild Hog has talked about for 3 versus 2. There were a lot of systems that were introduced in Shadow Warrior 2 that they've either removed or streamlined for 3 in order to make it feel more like an upgraded version of the 2013 game. The stated goal being that players should be able to focus on the action and not worry about all of the various statistics and things. I think that in theory that sounds very good. I actually didn't have so much of a problem with that in Shadow Warrior 2, but I definitely like the first better. So I think the streamlining and attempts to basically do Shadow Warrior 1's systems to the max, so to speak, sounds really good. The game is again set in neo-feudal Japan. You again take the role of Lo Wang, and honestly, I would have taken a Shadow Warrior that was building on 2 rather than 1. I think they're both great games, but this is probably going to be the better version of what a Shadow Warrior sequel could be, and I can't wait to play it. It's landing on Windows, PS4, and Xbox One on March 1st. And number 5 is Gran Turismo 7. We have been waiting for Gran Turismo 7 for a long time. Now, Gran Turismo Sport had its advantages and its disadvantages. They streamlined it, they made it a very specifically focused racing game, and for that reason, I do feel that it was definitely a step forward in most respects for the series, but it also didn't really give us a lot in terms of options or roster or single player stuff. It was primarily focused on multiplayer because that was the era. They were really trying to push these multiplayer racing games. Gran Turismo 7 looks like it's taken on a lot of what they learned making Sport and building out from it. At least that would be my perception of it, because they're keeping so many of the things that they added from Gran Turismo Sport, like Sport Mode, Brand Central, and Discover. But we're also seeing a lot of classic features return, like the used car dealership, the driving school, special events, championships, etc. I think it's if Gran Turismo Sport was a traditionally sized Gran Turismo game with all of those types of options, and that's basically exactly what I wanted for Gran Turismo 7. I'm really excited for this game because, as far as I'm concerned, this is the console racing game to beat. It always is. Much as I like Forza and Forza Horizon, Gran Turismo is really beefy in a way that I don't think any other console racing game is. is, and I'm certainly playing it when it lands on PlayStation 4 and 5 on March 4th. And number 4 is Triangle Strategy, a game coming to us from Art Dink, published at Square Enix. It's a tactical RPG brought to us by the producer of Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler. And honestly, between the art, what I've seen of the game, it's really evoking Final Fantasy Tactics for me. Obviously, Nintendo has also been the home for the Fire Emblem games, so we're gonna probably see a lot of comparisons to that, but like what I'm really seeing here is some Final Fantasy Tactics spiritual succession type things. I'm really excited for this personally. It's just really fun to see this sort of sprite on polygon Octopath Traveler aesthetic adapted to the old Final Fantasy Tactics same thing, sprite on polygon isometric aesthetic. I think people forget that that's what that game was. And I think this is going to function as just a fantastic update to that formula. I'm absolutely going to be dumping a ton of time into this one. I enjoyed Octopath Traveler so much, and my only complaint with that was that there could have been more of a like intertwining story, but the structure of this type of a game I think really lends itself to having a story that probably works a little bit better as a game. Triangle Strategy lands on Switch March 4th. I am absolutely there. At number 3 is Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, a game whose title and aesthetic really obscures what this actually is. It sounds like something that's very silly, right? Like even a kid's game. And it certainly is silly, but it's not a kid's game. It comes to us via the Borderlands folks. So it's more of that, except in a fantasy setting. In fact, it kind of looks like fantasy Borderlands to me. Now, what particularly excites me is you've got Will Arnett as the primary villain. You've got Andy Samberg as one of the adventurers. And you've got a massive improvement in terms of environments. Like if you pause any of the trailer and have a look at what's going on in the background, it's kind of shocking that it comes to us from the Borderlands folks. But like if you pay attention to the characters and what they look like, it's very obvious that it's from the Borderlands folks. I really look forward to this. It looks like a really interesting sort of mishmash of a few different ideas by a very specific developer, and I think that could play out really well. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands comes to PC, the PlayStations, and the Xboxes March 25th. And number 2 is Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin, is an alternate universe retelling of the very first Final Fantasy. Now, this is a really interesting idea. It is a dark fantasy reinterpretation of the world, and Koei Tecmo Games, as well as Team Ninja, act as co-developers here. They've really gone out of their way to call it a more mature Final Fantasy action RPG rather than Final Fantasy Souls or Final Fantasy Born. But Team Ninja developed Neo 1 and 2, and those are fantastic Soulsborne type games. So I think that it's reasonable to expect that's the kind of game it is. However, it's going to be obviously a lot different in presentation. It is a Final Fantasy game. It's apparently not an exact retelling of the story. There's a lot that's been reimagined. But frankly, I'm interested. I'm in. Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin comes to the PC, the PlayStations, and the Xboxes March 18th. And finally, at number 1 is a very different looking game called Ghostwire Tokyo. It's one that we've heard about for a while now and has had some pretty bizarre events happen in public. But it's an action RPG in which most of the people living in Tokyo just disappear one day as spirits invade. Yes, spirits. You're a detective trying to figure out what's going on while also being possessed by a spirit who gives you supernatural powers. Now, the combat has actually been designed by Shinichiro Hara, who's a gentleman who actually worked in the design of the combat in the 2016 Doom reboot. So I'm pretty excited to see how that plays out. It's really interesting. This is a Bethesda published game who is now owned by Microsoft and is technically part of Xbox Game Studios, but they'll be publishing the game as a PlayStation 5 exclusive and Microsoft Windows, later publishing it on Xbox. We'll probably see it in a year or so. I imagine that's probably the time exclusive on it, but you'll be able to play it on PlayStation 5 and Windows on March 25th. We have a couple of bonus games for you before we let you go. First is WWE 2K22, which I am just interested to see based on the fact that they didn't do a 21 and 20 was so negatively received. My hope is that it's a wake-up call and we get the WWE game that we want and deserve as people who support that type of a game. WWE 2K20 was not its best. That's landing on March 11th. Grand Theft Auto 5 is going to land on PS5 and Xbox Series X. I'm excited for a few enhancements, nothing major, but seeing HDR, ray tracing, and way faster load times are definitely going to be fun to return to the world of Los Santos again. It's been a while since I played Grand Theft Auto 5, honestly. I'm interested in playing it. It's landing on PS5 and Series X on the 15th. Crusader Kings 3, the world-building strategy RPG with a massive amount of possibilities, coming to consoles, PS5 and Xbox Series X and S on March 29th. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, the fighting game based on Persona 4, originally released in 2013. It will be very nice to play this on newer consoles. It's being released on PS4 and Switch. I'll be playing it on Switch. That's landing March 17th. And finally, Chocobo GP. I don't even know how to describe this. It's a Final Fantasy kart in some respects, I guess. It looks fun. I think that it sounds interesting, especially in a world in which we aren't just dropping new kart games into the public every 5 seconds. That happened about 15, 20 years ago. If you're doing it now, you're doing it with purpose. So I'm willing to give Chocobo GP a spin when it lands on Switch March 10th. That's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications, and as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.